Well, while we figure out the slides, I guess I will start with play you a song on this keyboard instrument that I built called the 7-limit mosaic chord. Here's a microphone. Here's what the keyboard looks like. And that piece was a piece by Bach called Beret, I believe it's pronounced. It's usually played on guitar. So what is this thing? I guess I'll start with explaining its physical characteristics here. It has over on the top left. There's a number of. So I should say it is not a synthesizer yet. It's a keyboard controller. So it's controlling an external synthesizer. Right now I'm using Surge XT on my laptop there. There's a handful of knobs in the upper left that can be used to control various parameters like volume and reverb. There's a screen with a menu system. Nothing terribly exciting about that part of it. There is a teensy microcontroller, Teensy 4.0, which runs the firmware that There's a program on there that scans the keys and generates the correct MIDI commands. There's the MIDI output can go out over USB, or there's standard MIDI DIN plugs, both in and out. I also stuck a CAN bus interface on there because I could. And on the bottom is there's a set of control buttons on the bottom left and bottom right for bottom left is set for octave transpose, and the ones on the right are semitone transpose, so you can get it in whatever key you want. The big spacebar thing is a pitch bend control. And the most interesting thing that most of the talk will be about is that middle section where all the keys are. There's 113 covering 4 octaves, 28 notes per octave, and they're all pressure sensitive. So, way the talk is structured, basically, I will explain, a lot of the questions that I usually get, like why is the keyboard shaped like that? How does that relate to musical structure? How does it work, and how did I make it? How did the manufacturing aspects of it work? So, as far as why I made it, one of the reasons is based on a approximation that we're kind of used to dealing with in 12-tone equal tempered music, where we kind of assume that the 12th through to 2 to the 4th power is really, really close to 1 1/4, and it's actually not. The way, and I will explain that further. Typical 12-tone equal temperament that most modern music is performed in these days. You take an octave, which is a doubling of frequency. You split it up into 12 logarithmically equal steps. So each note is higher in pitch by a factor of the 12th through to 2 than it's the one next to it. And there's an interesting thing happen, like why do we use 12 and not like 11-tone equal temperament or 13-tone equal temperament or any of the other temperaments that we might choose? And it's because the thing that we actually perceive, psychoacoustically as being in tune for a variety of reasons is when two sounds are making frequencies that are related to each other by some whole number ratio. So if you have a sound at 300 hertz and a sound at 200 hertz, it's a 3 to 2 ratio, and that's a musical interval of a perfect fifth. And here I've plotted, if you take the notes of the equal tempered scale, this is like a logarithmic pitch graph. All the equal tempered notes are equally spaced. And then you just kind of pick a bunch of very small whole number ratios, like the smallest ones you can think of that are between 1 and 2, and plot them on the top. And these notes were kind of selectively chosen, but you'll notice that they line up pretty well most of the time. Like this 3/2 and 4/3 here, that's the perfect fourth and the perfect fifth. And those work really well in equal temperament. But some of these notes, like this one over here, like take E, if we're in the key of C, it's off of the 5/4 by there's a tuning unit of measure called a cent, which is 100th of a semitone, and the equal tempered major third there, the E is off by almost 14 cents, which is kind of a lot. I mean, it's enough to be noticeable. So the next question is, why do we use, if it's off that much? Testing. Much better. Yeah, so if it's off that much, why do we use equal temperament? And it's basically because it's makes it a lot easier to build musical instruments. You can, and it makes it easy for performers. You can transpose to any key, and it doesn't really matter. Um, and people who are building musical instruments don't have this awkward question of, well, what notes do I include on my instrument? The decision's already been made. It's like everyone just chose to use these 12, and so you're not like, oh, I need this other note over there. That doesn't really happen in 12-tone equal temperament if you're satisfied with the 12-tone scale. And yet, there is something to be gained by tuning these intervals exactly, and there's not really a lot of instruments that do this. Uh, you know, and so I built this instrument so that we'd have some instrument that you could play just intonation on a keyboard. I've done guitars in the past too. Keyboards are kind of a little bit easier, just from the practicality of cramming. Guitars are hard because if you cram too many notes in a small area, then you kind of run out of space. Kite guitar, by the way, solves that in kind of an interesting way, but that didn't exist when I'd started this project years ago. Let's see. So if if we're tuning by exact ratios, there's this problem that shows up that we end up needing a lot more than 12 notes, even for just regular 12, music that was composed by 12-tone equal temperament. You easily, you realize, oh, I actually need two different major seconds, and those were these ones on this previous slide here. This 9/8 and 10/9. There's two notes there, and they're really close together. And if you're playing based on the ratios, and if you play the wrong one, it sounds very off. So suddenly we're like, well, we're only playing this 12-tone scale, but suddenly we need like 16 notes instead of 12, and it just kind of balloons from there because there's an infinite number of whole number ratios, and so that means you can have, you can add as many notes as you want. There's a useful way of organizing those notes called a lattice or a tonnettes. And this is a graph that's often used in, you'd see it in textbooks on harmony theory and stuff. And it basically lines up notes on a grid where in this case, the horizontal axis is you're moving in perfect fifths, which corresponds in what's called just intonation and ratio tuning as multiplying by factors of 3. And the upper right diagonal axis is moving in powers of 5, which we call those major thirds. That's the standard musical notation for that. And this is the kind of the scale that I used for my keyboard. These are all the notes that I have that just deal with factors of 5, prime factors up to 5. That's called 5-limit just intonation. 7-limit just intonation is if you include powers of 7. And then suddenly things get a lot messier because then the powers of 7 are their own axis. So suddenly your grid is a 3-dimensional shape. And it's actually kind of hard to visualize. But this is ooh, testing. Okay. I'll step away from that speaker, I guess. So that's the set of notes that I use. And let's see. So we could take that set of notes and kind of map it onto a regular grid, which is what most people do in this sort of situation if they're doing a microtonal keyboard, either a regular grid or a hex grid. But the set of notes that I use it's not really amenable to that very easily because you lose what's called isomorphism, which is to say that there's a certain hand shape that you'd want for a certain chord, and you'd want it to be the same as you're moving around the keyboard. And it doesn't really work to have an isomorphic keyboard and also have this kind of weird hodgepodge of semi-arbitrarily chosen notes. There might be a way to solve that, but I couldn't think of one. So instead of a regular grid, I thought, well, what if I just do an irregular grid? And we take these 28 notes and we kind of rotate them a little bit so that they don't line up, exactly on top of each other. And we make multiple copies because that previous copy was only 1 octave. So if we want like a 4-octave keyboard, we need a lot more keys. And you do this and you find, you adjust this until none of the keys are really right on top of each other. And then, once you decide the key centers, well, then you run a Voronoi diagram solver over the thing, and you suddenly have polygons. And it's kind of visually appealing if it is a little bit confusing to look at. But if you don't hyper focus on the shapes of the keys and think more in terms of how your hand's traveling and distances between, the distances and angles for doing musical intervals are all consistent, even if the shapes kind of look a little bit chaotic. And just, from people who are familiar with something like a piano and want to know how do you actually play something recognizable on here? This is a major scale. Should stick this up here so I can actually demonstrate it. That's fairly straightforward. If you play the blue keys that are down below instead of the yellow keys, you get a minor scale. And the take the first, third, and the fifth, you get a major chord. If you add that, there's a 7/4 there that if we wander out of the usual 12 tones scale, that's a 7. What are the one of the 7 limit intervals? Incidentally, the piece I played at the beginning was pure 5 limit. There were no 7 limit intervals. Might be an interesting exercise to figure out a way to introduce those somewhere in that piece. Okay, so how does it work? So on the basic level, you have the keys. They're producing some kind of analog voltage, and that gets fed through a multiplexer that feeds into one of the analog inputs on the Teensy 4.0. And the Teensy 4.0 runs a bit of firmware that converts that into the appropriate MIDI commands to tell a external synthesizer what sounds to make, and you get audio out of that in the end. The keys themselves, I use a kind of force-sensitive resistor approach. The key, this is the 1/1 key. This is what it looks like if you zoom in. You have this pattern of interdigitized fingers of exposed copper um, that and then there's a sheet of I use Velostat, which can be used as a force-sensitive resistor. It just looks like a piece of black plastic, kind of. It's basically indistinguishable visually from like a plastic garbage bag, but has the interesting property that if you put pressure on it, its electrical resistance drops. So you can use it as a very simple, variable resistor. And the Teensy 4.0 doesn't have, you know, over 100 analog input, so I have to multiplex this somehow. And I did the multiplexing in a kind of a weird way, and how I got here is kind of complicated, but in retrospect, a standard analog multiplexers would probably have been a little bit simpler, but in the end, this works fine. I'm using, the trick is to use open collector shift registers that, their output state is either, a pin is either a not connected to the circuit, or when it's on, it becomes a low impedance path to ground. And so what happens is if you want to list, you want to measure one key, well, they're all the key, one half of all the keys is wired up to one of the output of one of these shift registers, and the one that you want to listen to gets connected to ground, and the others just kind of are left floating. And there's a pull-up resistor trying to pull this thing up to 3.3 volts, and whatever voltage is floating on your ADC line there tells you what the pressure is on that key. As you press harder, the voltage sags, and the only the one you care about is connected to the ground. So even though the other ones are still kind of sort of connected to the circuit, they're only connected on one side, so they don't really matter. Um, Oh, and one weird side effect of using shift registers this way that I kind of like and makes me not want to go back to using, standard multiplexers is that I don't have to decide up front how many keys are going to need to be read by the system. So, I can change the keyboard layout and say, hey, I want one that has 200 keys or 300 keys, and I don't have to change anything. I don't run out of address bits on the shift register. You can just add more until the electrical problems become insurmountable. Um, and you can also do kind of a plug and play thing where you could plug devices in and they could get identified by having, the first inputs aren't actually ADCs or they aren't connected to FSRs, but they're connected to fixed resistors. So you read the first channel and you say, oh, that's 50 ohms, so I know what device was just connected to this. Um, Oh, and there's also for these that whole shift register ADC thing. There's actually 4 buses. The way it's organized is there's 4 groups of 40. So it's basically it acts like a 160 channel digital voltmeter, but it gets multiplexed down into four channels that get read by the Teensy's 2 ADCs. So I can actually read two channels at once. And also I can do that about 500 times a second, scanning the entire key bed, which has kind of surprised me how fast modern ADCs are. Oh yeah, so the source code that's up on GitHub for the um, uh, the code that runs on the Teensy. and it's not super exciting. It's kind of grown in complexity over the years, months and years, and but basically it just interprets key presses and generates the appropriate MIDI and manages the screen and menu system. Um, there's a lot I could say about the outputting MIDI. So MIDI is a standard that's been around since what 1983-ish, and it was kind of originally designed around 12-tone equal temperament and designed around instruments that look very much like pianos. Um, there's some standards like the MIDI tuning standard for doing custom tuning tables, but very few synths actually support it. And one of the interesting things you can do to do microtonal music with MIDI is you can take advantage of pitch bend. So the way MIDI works is you send this pitch bend command and it bends the pitch of all the notes that are sharing a particular channel. It's not a per note thing, but it seems like okay, this is good for monophonic synths, but how do you do microtonal polyphony that way? And there's an old trick that is you just use all the available MIDI channels, which there are 16 of them. So if you only play one note at a time per channel, you can just play whatever pitch you want by picking the closest equal tempered note and then pitch bending. So you send the pitch bend first, and then you send the note on, and then the note plays at exactly the pitch you wanted. Um, um, Unfortunately, that only works for synths that support receiving over multiple channels at once, which weirdly is a lot of the like 1990s and 2000s era digital Rompler synths that play, recorded samples of acoustic instruments and things like that. There's lots of those out there, and they're relatively inexpensive because they're not like super in demand. Um, a lot of the old classic synths like the Junos and Jupiters and so on. They just don't work with this because they only listen on one channel at once. And the situation has improved quite a bit since the MIDI Association added the MPE standard, which basically is just a standardized way of doing what I just explained, where you're playing one note at a time per channel. And that's been around for, well, I guess, what, 7 years now. And another nice thing about doing one note per channel is that not only can you do pitch bend, but you can do all the other MIDI CC commands that are meant to affect a whole channel, but you can have them affect a specific note. Like the one I use a lot is channel volume. So you can do volume swells just by sending the appropriate command. MPE does that by sending channel pressure rather than the CC, but it's very similar. Yeah, most synths weren't really designed to work this way, so you kind of have to do, support synths on a case-by-case basis. So it's sort of a matter of like, hey, I've got this synthesizer. What weird workarounds do I need? And a lot of it is, looking through the user manual, finding out what the what the range of channel select MSB and LSB bits they use, and there's a lot of fiddly details that aren't that much fun, but um, when it works, it's great. Uh, okay, so as far as physically how this keyboard works, the wooden parts are made out of birch ply. Um, I use transient dye, which is a fairly standard wood dye for the coloration. Um, the keys themselves are made by, I take plywood and I glue a sheet of felt to the back, and then I laser cut them out. And so the keys come out as just, wood shapes with felt backing, which gives it a pleasant squishy feel to it. So you're not just pressing on a super hard surface. Uh, oh yeah, the PCBs I had made by JLC PCB, designed them in KiCad. Turns out that designing PCBs isn't that hard. I don't have a degree in electrical engineering or anything like that. I'm just kind of a hobbyist and was able to figure this stuff out. I've done, there's a number of boards involved. Oh yeah, here's the stack up. Um, so there's two PCBs that are involved. There's one that's just the key bed, and it has shifter registers and capacitors and maybe a few resistors, and that's about it. And then the everything else PCB that has the microcontroller and controls and so on. Let's see. These weren't too hard to design, other than, oh yeah, the actual key shapes. I have a Haskell program that I wrote that about 10 years ago when I started working on this project that generates the key shapes, and it also generates the PCB traces for the keybed aspect of this. And importing those into KiCad was kind of painful, but eventually I figured out how to do it. There's probably better ways than the way I did it. But the fact that KiCad can import SVGs definitely helped a lot. And there's what the original version looks like. That I didn't bring it today, but it was kind of all it was all solderless breadboards and a Raspberry Pi, and it worked, but not very well. But it demonstrated that it was playable and was kind of fun to use if you didn't mind trying to fiddle with all the parts that would fall off and so on. And yeah, that's the end of my talk. There's a website where I've got more information. I've got a user manual that's online. The source code's online. There's not a whole lot of content of videos of people using it, but hopefully we'll get some of that eventually. Yeah, that's. How am I for time? Oh, I guess we're at the end. And there's nothing after this, so I guess I'm not going to get chased out. So I suppose if anybody has questions, I can take questions. Sure.
Oh yeah. What about velocity? Can you get velocity from the pressure sensors?
Yes, I do. It's a little bit tricky to use velocity and pressure at the same time because most synths don't really handle it very well. But the trick for doing velocity is you just ignore the first pressure reading that was over the activation threshold for that key and wait for the second one to come along. And then you use the difference between those two to infer how hard the key was hit. And that works pretty well. You know, it's not amazingly great, but you know, I could probably do a lot of fine tuning to get it better.
I have two questions. You showed the original and this one. Are these the only two that have ever been made, or have you made others?
No, there's about I think so. I've made at least 10 or 9 of these, and there's another one that's kind of half assembled. If I didn't completely lose track and forget about one, so yeah, there's a bunch of them. Um, a few of them are out in the world. Most of them are kind of inventory or weird early prototypes.
You mentioned briefly which like synth software you're using. What was that called again?
So I'm using Surge XT usually when I'm using a laptop, which I am right now. Um, I haven't played around with a whole lot of soft synths. I've gotten Dexid to work, which is the DX7 emulator. Um, that one and I've gotten two synths to work with using tuning tables, which is kind of a totally different path than the MPE-ish approach. But um,
I needed to ask that to ask the other question. Did you pick Surge XT because it's amenable to what you're trying to do, or did you already like Surge XT and then it just happened to also work?
you know, I wasn't already familiar with Surge XT. I basically used it because it's what Roger Lynn recommends for the instrument users, and it's open source, it's free, um, and the fact that a bunch of instrument users are already using it, and that's MPE, means that there's already a handful of MPE patches that people have used. There's a lot of patches in Surge that just aren't, you know, they weren't made by people who had instruments that respond to key pressure, so they just don't do anything with key pressure. So you kind of you either use one of the instrument patches, or you take one of the other existing patches and then modify it to make it more expressive. But it's a little bit of work, and it's kind of nice when somebody else does the hard part, and you can just use their patch. Um, more questions? All right.
So, as someone who's also building or like kind of in the process of like doing a microtonal like keyboard controller, um, so the company that you formed was, first of all, was that recent?
Yeah, desideratasystems.com is the website, and it's Desiderata Systems LLC. I just started that recently.
How hard was it to start? I'm guessing you needed a decent amount of money for like business licensing and like even legal and stuff like that. Because I recently went to Control Voltage, and the guy and I were kind of discussing it, and like he kind of made it sound like it was really hard to like start a company and everything and all of that.
It's not. I mean, starting a company is pretty easy if it's just a single person, sole owner. You kind of just register with you know, you file a registration with the state. Now, I get, you know, if you want to be doing businessy things like you know, selling products and uh,
Sorry, not to cut you off. Please continue a sidebar discussion. But for anybody in this track 2 area who is interested in the puzzle hunt, please go over to track 1 right now.
yeah. So So there is you know, a lot of business stuff that gets complicated, but just to start the business, that part's easy and pretty cheap.